For 24 years, she sat above everyone, untouchable, unbothered, and unchallenged. Judge Cynthia Warwick wasn't loud. She didn't need to be. Her whispers could crush careers. Her gaze alone could silence a courtroom. Lawyers feared her. Defendants dreaded her. And justice? Well, justice had learned to stay out of her way. Until today, because today, something impossible was about to happen. Not from a senior attorney, not from a high-powered journalist, but from a 14-year-old black boy in khakis and sneakers who would step into her courtroom and put everything she built on the edge of collapse. His name was Micah Thompson. He had no legal degree, no title, no microphone, but he had one thing no one else in that room dared to carry: the truth. And he wasn't going to whisper it. It began like any other morning inside Jefferson County Courthouse in Birmingham, Alabama. The sun cut through the high stained glass windows, slicing gold light across the marble floor. Bailiffs moved with routine precision. The gallery buzzed with quiet conversations. And high on the bench, Judge Warwick adjusted her robe with the same chilling detachment she'd worn for decades. No one knew the boy sitting silently near the back. His notebook resting in his lap, his eyes locked on every detail, was about to shatter everything. Micah wasn't there for a school project. He wasn't lost. He was here on purpose, because he knew what no one else did. That today's defendant, Tyrone Wills, a 26-year-old black man accused of armed robbery, was innocent. And he knew that Judge Warwick wasn't just biased. She was covering something up. Micah had watched his community suffer under her rulings. He'd seen neighbors vanish into prison cells for crimes they didn't commit. He'd seen his older cousin break down after being sentenced for simply fitting the description. And he'd seen his own mother cry after Warwick throughout her housing discrimination case, without even reading his file. But Micah wasn't here for revenge. He was here because he'd learned the law wasn't just made of rules. It was made of people. And some of those people didn't deserve the power they held. So while Warwick raised her gavel to begin another trial she thought she already owned, Micah hit record on the small phone in his lap. This wasn't just a courtroom anymore. It was a battlefield. And a child was about to wage war against a judge and a broken system. Micah Thompson didn't grow up dreaming of bringing down a federal judge. He grew up dreaming of making it through a week without hearing the sirens, without seeing another black neighbor's door kicked in, without seeing his mom come home exhausted from her second job, only to face another eviction notice taped to their apartment door. He was just a kid. But in Jefferson Heights, childhood ended early. His mother, Denise Thompson, worked nights cleaning floors at the very courthouse where Judge Warwick sat in silence as lives were shattered. Denise had seen the faces: young, black, poor. She'd swept up the dust under their chairs after their sentencing. And she'd whispered to Micah again and again, "Baby, this system ain't built for us." Micah believed her until the day it took his brother, Marcus, barely 19, pulled over for a broken taillight. 1 week later, he was in jail, framed for possession with intent to distribute. The evidence? A plastic bag found under the patrol car after Marcus was already in cuffs. His court-appointed attorney barely said 10 words. Judge Warwick said just 6. Guilty, 20 years, no parole. Micah was 12 when he watched his mother collapse in that courtroom. That moment didn't break him. It made him quiet. He started asking questions, reading, studying, watching old hearings online, learning the names: Brady v. Maryland, Gideon v. Wainwright, Brown v's Board, learning how the law worked, how people twisted it, and how Judge Warwick, Polished, proper, and respected was the quiet storm behind it all. Her bias wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. She'd overrule black attorneys before they'd finish a sentence, sustain every objection from white prosecutors, ignore alibi witnesses, toss out exculpatory evidence. Her rulings were almost never reversed. She'd built a reputation of efficiency. What they really meant was, she made sure people like Marcus never got a second chance. Micah didn't know exactly how, but he knew she had power, and he knew power like that never acted alone. That's when he started connecting the dots. Cases that disappeared, complaints that never went public, files that couldn't be found. And that's why, the moment he heard Tyrone Wills was assigned to Judge Warwick's courtroom, he knew it wasn't random. He wasn't there to cause trouble. He was there to expose the truth. He didn't bring a protest sign. He didn't shout. He brought something far more dangerous to power. A voice that wouldn't stay silent, and a phone full of evidence. The moment Micah's phone hit the courtroom floor, the performance cracked. It wasn't loud, just a soft clack on the wood. But it landed like a thunderclap in a room built on silence. Judge Cynthia Warwick's eyes snapped up from her docket. Her voice, always cold and clipped, sliced through the stillness. "Young man, what do you think you're doing?" The entire room turned to stare at him. This 14-year-old kid in khakis holding a phone like it was a weapon. Micah didn't flinch. He stood slowly, the phone still in his hand, his voice calm but clear. "I'm just recording what's happening here, that's all." The gallery gasped. A few jurors shifted in their seats. Tyrone's public defender, Marcus Allen, looked like he'd been hit in the chest, but Warwick didn't gasp. She didn't blink. She seethed. "Bailiff, seize the device." The courtroom officer hesitated. Not because he was unsure of the command, but because of who gave it. Warwick had spent decades perfecting her role, untouchable, revered, always in control. But this wasn't control, it was rage. Philip Calloway, the assistant district attorney, leaned in from his table, trying to contain a smirk. "This is contempt, Your Honor," he said coolly, his eyes never leaving Micah. "This child has no right to disrupt the court." Micah spoke again, his voice louder this time. "I'm not disrupting anything. I'm recording the truth." Another stir in the gallery. A murmur from the back row. Warwick stood. "You do not get to define truth in this courtroom, boy." Micah stared back, unwavering. "Then why are you afraid of it being recorded?" That was the moment. The moment even the jurors started to look differently. Some leaned forward, others turned toward each other, whispering, because they'd seen it too. The overruled objections, the eye rolls at the defense, the way Calloway was allowed to wander off topic, unchecked, the way Warwick, had pushed this trial toward one conclusion, and one conclusion only. The bailiff reached for Micah's phone, but he stepped back. "You can take my phone," he said, "but not the truth. Because it's already out." And it was. What no one in the room knew, what not even Warwick had realized, was that Micah's phone had already synced the footage. It was uploading, encrypted, out of her reach. The courtroom fell silent again. But this time, it wasn't a silence of fear. It was the kind of silence that came right before an avalanche. Warwick clenched her fists, but her voice trembled when she spoke next. "Remove him. Now." And just as the officers took a step toward him, the doors burst open. The heavy courtroom doors slammed open with a force that silenced even the gasps. Two figures stepped in. Federal agents in dark suits. They moved with precision, like they'd been here before. But they hadn't. No one ever dared step into Warwick's courtroom without her permission. Until now, the taller of the two flashed his badge toward the bench. "Apologies for the interruption. Judge Warwick, we need a word. Immediately." Cynthia Warwick froze. Her voice, so used to slicing through disobedience, faltered for a second. "I'm in the middle of a trial." The female agent, calm but firm, stepped forward. "This pertains to this trial, and your conduct." Now the murmurs weren't whispers. They were full-volume curiosity. Jurors, reporters. Even the clerk leaned forward to catch every word. Micah, still near the aisle, didn't move. He didn't need to. His job was already done. He had sparked this moment. Now it was time to watch it burn. Warwick's face tightened. "You don't have jurisdiction to barge in here." "We do," the agent said, pulling out a sealed document. "Signed this morning. You are now under federal review for judicial misconduct, racial bias, and suppression of exculpatory evidence." A collective gasp filled the air. Warwick staggered back a half step. This is outrageous!" But the courtroom wasn't with her anymore. They weren't her captive audience. They weren't waiting for her permission to believe what they were seeing. They were watching her fall. Tyrone sat up straighter at the defense table. Marcus Allen blinked, as if waking from a trance. Even Calloway looked rattled, his pen frozen mid-note. One of the agents motioned toward the bench. "Please step down, Judge." Warwick clutched the edge of her bench like it might save her. "You have no idea who I am," she said, voice cracking. "You don't understand." Micah stepped forward. "I think we do," he said softly. Every head turned toward him. And then, to everyone's disbelief, he pulled out another phone. The screen lit up. "I recorded your instructions to the bailiff. The way you shut down every objection. The way you looked at Tyrone like he didn't deserve to breathe." Warwick's eyes widened. "That's illegal. That's inadmissible." "No," said the agent, taking the phone from Micah with gloved hands. "It's evidence." And just like that, power shifted. The woman who had sentenced hundreds with a whisper now stood powerless in the center of the room. No robe, no shield, just a human cornered by her own corruption. Micah turned to the crowd. "If she can be stopped, maybe the system can be fixed." And for the first time since the trial began, people began to believe it. The tension in the courtroom was now a living thing. Judge Cynthia Warwick hadn't stepped down yet. Her fingers still clutched the bench, knuckles white. The agents didn't force her. They didn't need to, because the real damage had already been done. Micah Davis stood before everyone, calm, unwavering, 14 years old, and holding a quiet sort of power that no one could ignore anymore. "I didn't just record her attitude," he said, voice low but firm. "I recorded the missing page from the case file, the one that was supposed to clear Tyrone's name." He turned to the defense table, where Marcus Allen looked stunned. Micah pulled a folded document from his backpack and handed it to one of the agents. This was in the trash can in the judge's chamber, along with 2 witness affidavits and an internal memo from the district attorney's office marked "Do not disclose." The entire room gasped again. Calloway went pale. Marcus rose slowly, taking the documents from the agent's hand. His voice cracked when he spoke. This is the store's security log. Tyrone was clocked in at work 5 miles away, at the exact time of the robbery. Warwick's lips parted, but no words came out. Micah wasn't done. He held up one more item, a USB drive. "This has the audio recording of the pre-trial meeting, where Judge Warwick told Calloway to bury anything that made the boy look clean." The audio played through the agent's portable speaker. Warwick's voice filled the room, sharp, deliberate, venomous. I don't want to hear about alibis. That kid's going down. I've ruled worse on less. A single sentence that set the courtroom on fire. People stood, hands covered mouths, eyes welled up. Reporters scrambled to capture every word. Warwick looked around as if she were waking up in a nightmare she couldn't escape. The courtroom, the place that had always been her fortress, was turning on her. The bailiff, once silently obedient, stepped away from the bench. The jurors, who had once avoided Micah's gaze, now stared at him with something entirely different. Respect, fear, hope. Tyrone sat frozen. Then slowly, quietly, he began to cry. It was a silent kind of weeping. Shoulders shaking as the truth he'd been screaming for months finally echoed through voices louder than his own. The lead federal agent looked at Warwick. "We're going to need you to come with us." She didn't resist. Not this time. Micah turned to the room, his voice steady. "Power is loud, but truth doesn't need to shout." And somehow, that hit harder than the recording. As Judge Warwick was escorted from the bench, her wrists cuffed, her silence louder than all the arguments she'd ever overruled, the courtroom didn't cheer. It didn't breathe. For the first time in 24 years, that room didn't know how to react. Because no one had ever seen justice walk in through the side door and win. Micah Davis didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He watched her leave with a calm stare that didn't belong to a boy his age. It belonged to someone who'd already accepted the cost of what he'd just done. But not everyone in that room was ready to accept defeat. Philip Calloway, the young prosecutor, once so cocky, so protected, stood up fast. His voice cracked but carried. "This is insane. That child should never have been in here. None of this is admissible. This is a mistrial. This is contempt of court." The new judge, an older man named Judge Raymond Elliott, summoned after the agents took control, slowly rose from his seat. "Mr. Calloway," he said, voice like gravel and steel. "I've read the affidavits. I've reviewed the security log. I've heard the recording." He turned toward the agents, then toward Micah. "I've also received confirmation from the federal court. Everything this young man has presented is not only valid, it's damning." Calloway's breath caught. "You're not walking out of here untouched either," the judge continued. "We'll be reviewing your role in suppressing evidence. You may want to retain counsel." Calloway sat down so quickly he almost missed his chair. Micah didn't blink. He turned to face Tyrone Wills, still seated beside his stunned attorney. The man who had once walked into court expecting to lose his freedom now looked at Micah like he was witnessing something divine. "I thought it was over for me," Tyrone whispered. Micah nodded slowly. It almost was. He turned toward the gallery. The jurors, the officers, the clerks. Everyone who had played their roles in Warwick's courtroom for years. Some looked away. Some couldn't stop looking at him. This wasn't just about a judge. It was about them. About the silence they had accepted. The systems they had helped maintain. Not with malice, but with indifference. The judge spoke again. "I'm ordering an immediate dismissal of all charges against Mr. Wills. Furthermore, this courtroom will be placed under federal investigation effective immediately." A gasp rippled through the room. Micah turned to leave, but stopped at the door. He looked back one final time, his voice low, direct. "Justice isn't broken. It's just too quiet. I came to turn the volume up." Then he walked out. And for the first time in 2 decades, the Jefferson County Courthouse didn't feel like a fortress. It felt like a beginning. The click of the handcuffs echoed like a gunshot. Sharp, final, unmistakable. Judge Cynthia Warwick, once the untouchable queen of that courtroom, was now just a woman in cuffs, standing before the very bench where she had crushed so many lives. The silence was deafening. No gavels, no orders. Just justice, raw and real, unfolding in front of an audience that never thought they'd see this day. Elijah Brooks didn't move, didn't smile, didn't cheer. He simply watched. His hands were clenched, not out of fear, but from the weight of everything that had led to this. Years of silence. Years of watching his community live in fear of that bench. And now, it was over. Or at least, it seemed over. Federal agents led Judge Warwick out through the side door, past the stunned jury, past the stone-faced bailiff, past Brandon Lowell, who now sat pale and trembling behind the prosecutor's desk. She didn't look at anyone, not even at Elijah, but he saw it, the flicker of shame in her eyes, the same eyes that had once dared him to speak, to defy her, to stand. And he had, but winning doesn't always feel like victory. As the courtroom slowly breathed again, Elijah looked around. Tyrone Wills stood behind him, hands still shaking, not from fear, but from release, from freedom. It had cost him everything, his job, his name, his peace. But now, at last, he was free. Marcus Allen, his defense attorney, wiped tears from his eyes as the judge declared the charges officially dismissed. It felt like redemption, but it also felt like a scar that would never fully heal. Because while one man had been saved, Elijah knew this wasn't just about Tyrone. There were others, too many, still behind bars, still trapped beneath the silence. He looked to the cameras, to the reporters scrambling for statements, to the people in the gallery who had once whispered and watched in fear. Now they were standing, clapping, nodding, but not for him, for what he had done, for what they had seen. Justice wasn't just restored, it was exposed, and that exposure came with a cost. Elijah's name would now be known, respected by many, feared by some. He would no longer be just a boy who stood up. He'd be a target, a reminder, a threat to those who still used the law as a weapon. And yet, he didn't regret it. As Tyrone walked out the courtroom doors and the sun spilled in like a blessing, Elijah followed behind, carrying the burden and the flame, because this wasn't just about ending something. This was about starting everything that came next. The courtroom was empty now, chairs pushed in, files closed, silence settling like dust after a storm. But for Elijah Brooks, it was anything but over. He stood near the doors, staring back at the room where everything had changed, where a 14-year-old boy had stared down power and refused to blink. His father stood beside him now, not saying much. He didn't have to, because in the way he looked at Elijah, there was everything. Pride, awe, gratitude. "You didn't just win a case," he finally said, voice soft. "You reminded the world what justice is supposed to feel like." Elijah nodded slowly, but he felt the ache too. This wasn't a movie. It didn't end with applause. It ended with responsibility, with weight, with the knowledge that people would now look to him, expect him to keep going. And he would, because silence had never saved anyone. Across the city, TVs replayed the footage. The judge being led away. The boy who stood up. The trial that shattered a system's illusion of invincibility. In living rooms, people whispered his name. At dinner tables, they asked their kids, "What would you have done?" And in a small middle school across town, a girl raised her hand and said, "I want to be like Elijah." That's how it starts. Not with revolutions, not with riots, but with quiet choices, made by people who refuse to be silent. Elijah didn't set out to be a hero. He just saw something broken and didn't look away. He stepped into the fire. Not because he thought he'd win, but because no one else would. And in doing so, he changed everything. So if you're watching this and something inside you stirred, maybe it was anger, maybe it was hope, maybe it was recognition, then ask yourself, what would you have done? Because justice doesn't need superheroes. It needs witnesses. It needs voices. It needs courage. Even if it's only 14 years old. The system trembled because one child refused to stay silent. They called him just a kid. Too young to understand, too small to matter. But Elijah didn't wait for permission. He became the reminder we all needed. That truth isn't measured by age. It's measured by courage. At KaYi, we don't just tell stories. We uncover the fight behind every quiet hero. The ones who rise when justice falls silent. If this story stirred something in you, hold on to it. Because change doesn't start in courts. It starts in hearts. And sometimes, all it takes is one voice. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to stay with us on this journey. Where every story is real, every truth is raw, and every voice matters. This is KaYi, where courage meets the moment.